You'll be worthless with a child, the millionaire CEO sneered. 4 years later, he saw her in the park holding their daughter with his eyes. Emma stood in the corner of the sleek office, her hands trembling as she clutched the small plastic stick that had altered the course of her life forever. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind Michael stretched out over the glittering skyline, but all she could see was his back, tall and broad, the reflection of the city lights glinting in his dark hair. She had rehearsed 100 ways to tell him, had imagined softer outcomes, had prayed that the man she loved would see the news as a blessing. When the words finally left her lips, they came out in a whisper, but the silence in the room made them sound louder, heavier, as though they had been carved into stone. For a moment, he did not move, his posture straight and still like a statue. She thought he hadn't heard her, but then he turned, his piercing blue eyes locking on her with a look that made her stomach twist. Michael's expression was unreadable at first, his features calm in a way that unnerved her. She took a small step forward, desperate for a sign of warmth, for some hint that he might embrace her, take her hand, and tell her they would face this together. Instead, his lips curved into a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes, and his voice came out as sharp and final as a blade. You'll be worthless to anyone with a child. The words hit her harder than any blow. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even stand properly. Her knees trembled as though they might give way, and her grip on the pregnancy test faltered. She had expected shock, denial, maybe even anger, but she had never expected cruelty spoken so plainly, as if she were nothing more than a mistake on his path to success. "Michael, you don't mean that," she managed to whisper, her voice breaking as she held the test out toward him like proof of something sacred. "This is our baby. Yours and mine." Her blue eyes pleaded with him, searching for the man she thought she knew, the man who once whispered promises in the quiet of the night when they were tangled together far from the world. But his gaze was ice, his jaw set with a kind of pride that was unshakable. He stepped closer, towering over her, and though his voice dropped, it carried the weight of something immovable. "I don't want this, Emma. I won't let it tie me down. You made your choice, but I won't be part of it. Don't think for a second that dragging me into this will change anything." Her chest tightened, and she felt as though the air in the room had turned poisonous. The office that once seemed like a place of ambition and possibility now felt like a prison, each polished surface reflecting her pain back at her. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. She had already given him too much power. Slowly, painfully, she drew her hand back, the test still clutched in her palm like a broken promise. She wanted to scream, to demand how he could be so heartless, but her voice failed her, collapsing into silence. Michael turned his back on her then, his hands sliding into his pockets as he stared out the window at the empire he had built. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, perfect and untouchable, as though the woman standing behind him no longer existed. Emma watched him for one final moment, her heart shattering as she realized the man she had loved was gone, replaced by someone who valued his wealth and image more than the life they had created together. Her feet felt heavy as she walked to the door, every step echoing with the finality of his words. At the threshold she paused, her hand on the handle, her throat burning as she fought to keep her composure. For one fleeting second, she let herself look back. He hadn't moved, hadn't turned, hadn't shown the faintest crack in his armor. The sight cut her deeper than his words ever could. She opened the door and stepped into the cold hallway, her body shaking, her vision blurred by the tears she could no longer hold back. The sound of his voice lingered in her ears as she stumbled away, "You'll be worthless to anyone with a child." The cruelty of it echoed through her like a curse, but as she pressed her hand to her stomach, she felt the faintest flicker of defiance stir inside her. She would not be worthless. She would not allow her child to be defined by his rejection. And though her heart felt broken beyond repair, she made a silent vow as she walked into the night: she would fight for the life growing within her, no matter how alone she had to be. Emma left Michael's office with her world in pieces, but once the initial storm of despair had passed, she found herself clinging to a single unshakable truth: the child growing inside her deserved love, protection, and a chance at life. She cried for hours that night, her pillow damp and her body shaking with sobs that seemed to drain the very marrow from her bones, but when dawn broke through the thin curtains of her small apartment, she rose with a new kind of resolve. She had no one to lean on, no family nearby to offer support, no partner to share the burden, but she had herself, and she had the fragile heartbeat within her that gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. The months that followed tested her in ways she could never have anticipated. Her body ached as the pregnancy progressed, her back sore from standing too long at work, her feet swollen from endless shifts at the diner. The uniform that once fit easily grew tighter by the week, until she had to replace it with a second-hand version from a thrift store, one that smelled faintly of bleach no matter how many times she washed it. The customers rarely noticed her exhaustion, focused only on their plates of greasy food, but her coworkers saw the dark circles under her eyes and sometimes offered her an extra 10 minutes of rest, though none of them could truly grasp the weight she carried. At night, when she stumbled home, she would collapse into bed and whisper to her belly, telling her unborn child stories about the life they would share, promising that no matter how hard things became, she would never regret choosing them. The loneliness was often unbearable. She had loved Michael once with all her heart, had believed in the promises he made when they lay together in the quiet hours of the night, but those promises had shattered like glass. The rejection still cut deep, the echo of his cruel words returning at the worst moments, yet every time the baby moved inside her, Emma felt her strength renewed. It was as though the child was reminding her that she was not as alone as she felt, that the two of them were already a team bound by something stronger than pain. Sometimes she would place her hand over her stomach and close her eyes, imagining tiny fingers curling around hers, a smile she hadn't seen yet, a laugh that would one day fill the silence of her apartment. Her body bore the marks of sacrifice. Her ankles swelled after long shifts, her back throbbed when she carried heavy trays, and her skin grew pale from the strain of working while carrying a child. Yet Emma refused to quit. She saved every spare dollar, cutting back on her own meals to ensure she would have enough for diapers, clothes, and doctor visits. The refrigerator was often nearly empty, the cupboards bare, but she kept a small drawer filled with carefully folded baby clothes she had bought secondhand, each piece washed and smoothed as though preparing for royalty. She would take them out at night, running her fingers over the soft fabric, imagining her child nestled in them, safe and warm. One of the hardest moments came during her first ultrasound. The sterile room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and she lay on the narrow bed, her heart racing with fear and anticipation. When the screen flickered to life and she heard the rapid, steady beat of her baby's heart, tears slid down her cheeks unchecked. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, fragile and strong all at once. She reached for the blurry printout the nurse handed her and held it to her chest, feeling as though she had been given proof of the miracle she was carrying. Alone though she was, she whispered through her tears, "I'm here. I'll always be here. You'll never be unwanted." That promise became the anchor she clung to, repeating it on nights when despair threatened to overwhelm her. Emma's world shrank to the essentials: work, saving, and preparing for the day her child would arrive. She learned to live without luxuries, without rest, without the reassurance of a partner, but she also learned how much strength she truly carried. Every obstacle hardened her resolve, every insult from customers or dismissive glance from strangers only fueling her determination to prove that she and her child were enough. Though Michael's words still haunted her, whispering cruelly in the back of her mind, she fought them with every heartbeat she carried inside her. She was not worthless, and neither was her child. Together, they were already rewriting the story he had tried to end before it began. The night Sophia was born was one Emma would carry in her heart forever, both for its pain and its beauty. The labor began with a dull ache low in her back that spread across her body in steady waves, and though she had braced herself for this moment, the reality of it was far more overwhelming than she imagined. Alone in her small apartment, she gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her breath coming in sharp bursts as the contractions grew stronger. Fear crawled up her spine as she realized she couldn't do this by herself, not in these four suffocating walls. With trembling hands she called for a cab, dragging her bag down the stairs and into the wet night. The rain was falling hard, soaking her hair and plastering her clothes to her body, but she pressed forward, clutching her stomach with each painful step. The hospital was a blur of white lights and voices calling instructions she could barely follow. Nurses hurried her down long corridors, wheeled carts rattling nearby, machines beeping steadily in the background. Emma felt like she was being pulled into a storm she had no control over, her body racked by waves of pain that seemed to come faster and harder with every passing minute. She clutched the rails of the hospital bed, her knuckles white, her throat raw from crying out, her body drenched in sweat. The hours dragged on endlessly, and there were moments when she thought she would break apart completely. She begged silently for the strength to keep going, and each time her resolve faltered she placed her hand over her stomach, whispering that she was doing this for the tiny life inside her, that together they would make it through. When the final moments came, she thought her body might shatter under the strain, her screams torn from her chest as though they came from someone else. And then, cutting through all the noise, came a cry, sharp and piercing, the sound of new life filling the sterile room. Emma's body slumped in relief, her vision blurred with tears as the doctor announced, "It's a girl." Moments later they placed the small bundle in her arms, and she stared down at the most fragile and miraculous sight she had ever seen. The baby's face was red and wrinkled, her fists clenched tight, her cries demanding and fierce. Emma touched her daughter's cheek with shaking fingers and sobbed harder than she ever had in her life. When Sophia opened her eyes for the first time, Emma's breath caught. They were blue, bright and piercing, so achingly familiar that Emma thought for an instant her heart would break all over again. They were Michael's eyes, a reflection of the man who had turned her away, but in this tiny body they carried no cruelty, no rejection. In Sophia, those eyes were pure, innocent, untainted by pride or coldness. Emma pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and whispered the name she had chosen long before this night, Sophia. She said it again and again, letting the syllables settle into the air until they felt like a prayer. The hours after were a haze of exhaustion and wonder. The nurses checked vitals and moved briskly around the room, but Emma barely noticed them, her gaze fixed on the small miracle in her arms. She traced every detail of Sophia's face, her tiny nose, the faint curl of dark hair that clung damply to her head, the impossibly small fingers that wrapped instinctively around Emma's thumb. Each movement filled Emma with awe, and for the first time in months, the crushing loneliness eased. She was not alone anymore. As the night deepened, rain still beating against the hospital windows, Emma lay in the bed with Sophia cradled against her chest. The rise and fall of the baby's breathing steadied her own, and she closed her eyes with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The world outside could remain cold and cruel, Michael's words could echo forever in the back of her mind, but in this moment none of it mattered. What mattered was the fragile weight of her daughter in her arms, the soft sound of her tiny breaths, the certainty that she would fight for this child with every part of herself. Emma whispered promises into the quiet room, promises of love, of safety, of a life defined not by rejection but by resilience. When sleep finally pulled her under, she dreamed not of the past but of the future, of a little girl with dark hair running through a park, of laughter filling a space that had once been silent, of a bond that no one, not even Michael Grayson, could ever take away. Michael Grayson's life in those 4 years looked perfect on paper, a blueprint of success that magazines and television anchors loved to repeat as if he were some kind of modern legend. His company had doubled its profits, expanding across markets others were too afraid to touch, and his name became synonymous with ruthless ambition. At every gala, every press conference, he was the man people gravitated toward, tall and immaculate in his dark tailored suits, his blue eyes cool and unreadable. Photographers adored him, women competed for his attention, and investors hung on his every word. To the world, he was untouchable, the golden figure of power and wealth. But behind closed doors, when the lights of the city flickered outside his glass penthouse windows, Michael often felt as though his empire was made of sand, magnificent but hollow. His nights were filled with parties, with laughter that never reached his heart and champagne glasses that emptied too quickly. Women surrounded him, beautiful and eager, yet none stayed longer than a few weeks, and none stirred anything beyond fleeting distraction. He told himself he preferred it this way, that attachments were chains and he had cut himself free years ago. But sometimes, when he caught his reflection in the mirror after another shallow evening, he saw something he couldn't ignore, the faint shadow of regret flickering in his eyes. He dismissed it, drowning it in work and noise, but no amount of money or success seemed to silence it completely. He had mastered the art of control, yet there were moments he couldn't control memory. In the quiet, when he stood alone with a glass of scotch in hand, he would hear her voice again, soft and pleading, telling him she was carrying his child. He would see her face, her blue eyes filled with desperation, and he would hear his own voice answering, cold and merciless, "You'll be worthless to anyone with a child." The words replayed in his mind like an echo that refused to die. He told himself it was necessary, that he had made the right choice, that he had spared himself from a weakness that would have derailed his empire. But deep inside, where pride could not reach, something gnawed at him. The yacht became his latest distraction, a gleaming fortress of luxury floating on the open sea. He bought it not because he needed it, but because he wanted to prove he could own something others only dreamed of. It was equipped with every indulgence: marble countertops, private cabins, polished decks where the city's elite gathered to sip wine and discuss their fortunes. When Michael stepped aboard, the world saw a man in command of everything. Yet as the waves stretched endlessly before him, he often felt a sharp pang of emptiness, as though the horizon mocked him with something he couldn't buy. He would stand at the railing late into the night, the wind whipping through his dark hair, and feel a hollowness that no deal, no empire, no woman could fill. He convinced himself that this was simply the cost of greatness. Love was for the weak, family for the ordinary, and he was neither. And yet, in rare moments, a question surfaced: what if he had been wrong? What if he had thrown away something that mattered more than all of this? He would crush the thought quickly, bury it under spreadsheets, contracts, and headlines, but it always returned. While he stood in penthouses and on yachts, cocooned in wealth, Emma lived in another world entirely. In a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, she raised the daughter he pretended did not exist. Sophia's laughter-filled rooms Michael had never seen, her small hands reaching for a mother who never let her feel the absence of a father. At night Emma sat by the window with her child asleep against her shoulder, the glow of street lamps washing over their faces, and she whispered the very promises Michael had abandoned. Sophia grew strong and bright, loved fiercely by the woman who refused to let rejection define them. Michael did not know this. He did not know how much his daughter looked like him, how her dark hair fell in soft waves, how her blue eyes mirrored his perfectly. He did not know how much of himself had been carried forward without his permission. But the day was coming when he would see it, when the carefully built walls of his empire would crumble in the face of the truth he had spent years denying. And when that moment arrived, no amount of power or pride would protect him from what was waiting. Spring had arrived with a gentleness Emma had not felt in years, and for the first time in a long while she decided to give herself and Sophia a day away from the grind of survival. The park near their apartment was full of blooming trees, the air fragrant with the scent of lilacs, and children's laughter echoed across the fields. Emma held her daughter's small hand as they walked together along the gravel path, watching Sophia dart ahead with the boundless energy only a 4-year-old could possess. Her dark hair bounced around her shoulders, her blue eyes sparkling in the sunlight as she turned back to call, "Mommy, look at me." Emma laughed, her heart swelling, and opened her arms as Sophia ran back and leapt into them. Holding her daughter close, she pressed her face into the child's hair, inhaling the scent of innocence and joy that made every sacrifice worth it. They found a quiet spot under a blossoming tree and spread out a small blanket. Emma had packed a simple picnic, sandwiches, apples, and a treat of cookies she had baked the night before. Sophia sat cross-legged on the blanket, swinging her legs as she bit into an apple and chattered about the butterflies and the games she wanted to play. Emma listened, nodding, her eyes never leaving the little girl who had become her entire world. For a few hours, the weight of unpaid bills, long work shifts, and lonely nights seemed to lift. It was just the two of them, a mother and daughter creating memories in a place filled with laughter and light. Michael Grayson had not planned to be in that park at all. He had arranged a brief outdoor meeting with a business partner before heading to a dinner in the city. His polished car pulled up at the entrance, his dark hair combed neatly, his tailored suit immaculate as always. He walked with his usual air of command, his blue eyes scanning the space around him more out of habit than interest. But then his gaze snagged on something unexpected, something that made his steps falter in a way he hadn't experienced in years. At first he thought it was nothing more than a trick of the light. A blonde woman sitting under a tree, her head tilted back as she laughed, holding a little girl close. There were countless families in the park, it should not have mattered. But the more he looked, the more a strange unease built in his chest. The woman's hair shone golden in the sun, the exact shade he remembered running his hands through long ago, and though years had passed, the curve of her face and the way she held herself felt hauntingly familiar. And then his eyes fell on the child. She was laughing loudly, her small body twisting as she tried to escape her mother's tickles, her dark hair gleaming like polished silk. But it was her eyes that made Michael's heart nearly stop. Bright, piercing blue, clear as ice and painfully familiar. They were his eyes, replicated perfectly on a face far too young to belong to anyone but his blood. He stood rooted to the spot, his chest tightening as realization slammed into him. This was not just any child. This was his child. Emma felt the weight of someone's stare and turned, her laughter fading instantly as her gaze locked onto him. For a moment she couldn't breathe, her arms tightening protectively around Sophia. Their eyes met across the distance, and everything she had fought so hard to bury came rushing back, the office, his words, the cruelty that had cut her to pieces. He looked older, sharper, his presence as commanding as ever, but behind his confidence she saw something else, something unsettled. Sophia sensed the tension and looked up, her small hand tugging at Emma's sleeve. "Mommy, who is that man?" she asked innocently, her voice carrying just enough to reach Michael's ears. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion, and forced her lips into a faint, steady smile for her daughter's sake. "No one important," she said softly, though her eyes never left Michael's. Michael felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. The meeting he had arranged no longer mattered, the world around him blurred into insignificance. All he could see was the little girl with his eyes clinging to her mother, the woman he had once dismissed now staring at him with a strength that both shamed and disarmed him. For the first time in years, Michael Grayson, who had conquered boardrooms and controlled empires, stood utterly powerless, staring at the family he had thrown away. Michael stood frozen at the edge of the path, the voices and laughter of the park around him fading into nothing as his gaze locked onto the small girl clinging to Emma's side. He had built an empire on confidence and control, but in that moment his carefully constructed armor cracked, and all he could feel was a hollow ache deep in his chest. He took an involuntary step forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, and Emma immediately rose from the blanket, her arms wrapping protectively around Sophia as if to shield her from a threat. The look in her eyes was sharp and unyielding, the eyes of a woman who had carried years of pain alone and would not allow history to repeat itself. "Emma," Michael said, his voice lower and rougher than he intended, as though it had to fight its way out of his throat. The name tasted strange after so many years, familiar yet distant, and hearing it spoken aloud made Emma's jaw tighten. She shifted Sophia slightly, holding her daughter closer while keeping her gaze locked firmly on him. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her tone calm but cold, each word clipped like a blade. "Not near her." Michael's eyes darted to Sophia again, and the sight made his stomach twist. She was staring back at him curiously, her small face tilted to the side, her dark hair framing features that carried pieces of both him and Emma. But it was her blue eyes that shook him most, a mirror of his own, clear and piercing, carrying an innocence he had never deserved. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, to close the years of distance that separated them, but the weight of his past choices pressed heavily on him, silencing everything but the pounding of his heart. "Is she?" he began, his voice faltering before he forced himself to continue, "Is she mine?" The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time in his life, Michael felt truly afraid of the answer. Emma did not hesitate. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady even as her arms tightened around Sophia. "She is yours. The daughter you never wanted. The child you said would make me worthless." The memory of those words stung sharper than any accusation, and Michael felt the sting of shame rise hot against his skin. Sophia looked up at her mother, confusion clouding her innocent face. "Mommy, what do you mean?" she asked softly, her small voice trembling with the weight of words she could not yet understand. Emma bent down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face, and whispered something only the girl could hear. Her tone softened in that moment, filled with love and reassurance, but her eyes never left Michael's. He felt the distance between them like an unbridgeable chasm, one he had dug himself years ago with words he could never take back. Michael wanted to move closer, to explain, to beg, but his body felt anchored in place. He could see Emma's pain in every line of her face, the exhaustion of 4 years of struggle etched into her features. He thought of the nights he had spent in luxury, surrounded by noise and distractions, while she had likely been alone with a crying baby, with no one to turn to. The enormity of his absence hit him like a blow, and for the first time in his life, he felt small. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words heavy, almost breaking as they left him. It was not the kind of polished apology he was used to giving when smoothing over business deals, it was raw, stripped of pride, born from a place of deep regret. Emma's expression did not soften. She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and hurt that time had not erased. "Wrong doesn't erase the years you missed. Wrong doesn't undo the nights she asked for a father and I had no answer. Wrong doesn't give her back what you stole." The truth of her words pierced him, leaving him no room to argue, no space to retreat into arrogance. Michael lowered his gaze briefly, swallowing hard against the knot in his throat. When he looked up again, Sophia was still watching him, her blue eyes filled with a quiet curiosity that tore him apart inside. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was sorry, that he had been a fool, that he would do anything to earn her trust, but the words caught in his chest, unworthy of being spoken yet. Emma shifted Sophia on her hip, ready to walk away, and Michael felt panic surge through him. The thought of losing them again, of walking back into his hollow life without even trying, was unbearable. "Please," he said, his voice breaking in a way it never had before. "Don't shut me out completely. Let me try. Let me at least try to know her." Emma studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned slightly, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, and with quiet finality she said, "Trying now doesn't erase that you abandoned her then." She began to walk away, Sophia clinging to her shoulder, and Michael stood rooted in place, watching as the woman he had once cast aside disappeared down the path with the child who carried his eyes. The world around him returned slowly, the chatter of families, the rustle of trees, but Michael felt as though everything inside him had shifted. Michael could not forget the sight of Emma walking away with their daughter, her figure growing smaller against the backdrop of the park until she was gone entirely, leaving him standing motionless on the path. That night, for the first time in years, he returned to his penthouse and found it unbearable. The walls felt too clean, the rooms too empty, the silence suffocating. He poured himself a drink and stared at the city skyline that he had once considered his kingdom, but the glittering towers mocked him now. All the success, all the power, all the wealth meant nothing compared to the little girl who had looked at him with curious blue eyes. Those eyes followed him everywhere, in the mirror when he shaved, in the reflection of his office windows, in the ice of his glass as he lifted it to his lips. He could not escape them. Days passed, and the routines of his empire continued without faltering. Meetings were scheduled, contracts signed, deals closed, but Michael found his mind drifting constantly. He caught himself staring at reports he had once devoured with sharp focus, his mind replaying the sound of Emma's voice, the weight of her accusation, the strength in her words when she told him that being wrong could not erase years of abandonment. For the first time in his career, he missed deadlines and cancelled appearances. His board whispered about his distraction, speculated about a woman, but Michael ignored them all. The truth was more than a distraction, it was a reckoning. One evening, desperate for answers, he found himself driving toward the neighborhood where Emma lived. The car that usually carried him to skyscrapers and exclusive clubs now wound its way down cracked streets lined with modest apartments and small grocery stores. He parked far enough away that she wouldn't notice and waited, his heart pounding in a way it never had during hostile takeovers or million-dollar negotiations. Eventually he saw them, Emma holding Sophia's hand as they walked home from what looked like school or daycare. The little girl skipped beside her, her small backpack bouncing, her laughter bright and free. Emma looked tired, her shoulders carrying invisible weight, but her hand never left her daughter's shoulder. It was the picture of a life Michael had never been part of, yet every detail carved itself into him, piece by painful piece. He came again the next day, and the next, always staying hidden, watching from a distance. It was not pride that kept him there but fear. He did not know how to step into their lives without shattering the fragile balance Emma had built. But the more he watched, the more he realized he couldn't stay away. Each glimpse of Sophia, the way she skipped, the way her hair glistened in the sun, the way she tilted her head when listening to her mother, made him ache with a longing he could not ignore. He had missed everything, her first words, her first steps, her first smile. No empire could ever buy back those years. Finally, one evening, he gathered what courage he had left and knocked on Emma's door. The building was old, the hallway dimly lit and smelling faintly of damp carpet, so different from the gleaming lobbies he was used to. His knuckles rapped against the wood, and he almost turned away before the door opened. Emma stood there, her blonde hair pulled back, her eyes wary and sharp. She didn't look surprised to see him, as if she had expected this eventually, but her body remained tense, her hand still gripping the edge of the door as though she could shut him out at any second. "I need to talk," Michael said, his voice quieter than he had planned, stripped of the authority it usually carried. "Please." Behind her, Sophia peeked out, her small fingers curled around her mother's leg. The sight nearly undid him. The girl's eyes met his, wide and curious, and for a moment Michael forgot how to breathe. He wanted to kneel, to tell her everything, to explain why he had not been there, but he knew any words now would sound hollow. So he looked at Emma instead, desperate. "I can't change the past. I know what I did. But I want to try now. I want to know her. I want to be her father, if you'll let me." Emma's lips tightened, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "Words are easy, Michael," she said finally, her voice calm but hard. "Promises are easy. You weren't there when she was born, when she was sick, when she cried for a father she didn't have. You weren't there when I worked double shifts to pay for her clothes and food. You weren't there for anything." Her words struck like blows, each one heavier than the last. She glanced down at Sophia, then back at him. "If you want to be in her life, you'll have to prove it. Not to me, but to her. And proving it will take more than words." Michael felt the sting of her truth, but instead of retreating, he nodded slowly, his voice trembling but sincere. "Then I'll prove it," he said. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect you to believe me yet. But I will show her that I'm not going to disappear again." For once, he didn't try to negotiate terms or argue his position. He simply accepted the weight of the task before him. Emma didn't answer right away. She opened the door just enough for Sophia to step back inside and then looked at Michael one last time before closing it softly but firmly. He stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, his heart pounding, his mind full of doubts. But beneath it all was something he hadn't felt in years: determination, not for business or power, but for the chance to finally be a father. As he turned to leave, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not walk away again. The days that followed Michael's visit to Emma's apartment were not easy, but for the first time in years he welcomed difficulty. He began with small gestures, things that seemed insignificant compared to the scale of the empire he had built, but that carried more weight than any business triumph ever had. He offered to walk Sophia to school, unsure if Emma would let him, and when she hesitated, he simply stood there, waiting. Eventually she agreed, and so he found himself holding a tiny hand in his own as they crossed the cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood. Sophia skipped beside him, asking endless questions about the cars, the birds, the clouds, her voice alive with curiosity. Michael answered clumsily at first, realizing how little practice he had at speaking with a child, but her laughter loosened something in him that had been locked away for far too long. Each day he returned, and each day Emma watched closely, ready to step in if he faltered, but Michael did not waver. He helped with homework, fumbling over simple words in storybooks until Sophia giggled and corrected him. He learned how to make pancakes, burning the first few until she declared with a grin that they were perfectly crispy, and he found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in years. He even allowed her to braid his hair clumsily with bright pink ribbons, sitting still while Emma watched from across the room with an expression torn between disbelief and the faintest trace of amusement. For a man who had once defined himself by control and perfection, these messy, imperfect moments became the ones he cherished most. Emma remained cautious. She remembered too well the way he had walked away, the sharpness of his rejection, the years she had spent struggling alone. She could not forget how she had wept in hospital corridors with no one to hold her hand, how she had carried bills in her pocket and whispered prayers that she would have enough to feed her daughter. She had carried all of it alone, and Michael had not been there. Forgiveness was not something she could hand out easily, and he never asked her to. Instead, he showed up quietly, consistently, allowing time and persistence to do the work his words could not. One evening, after Sophia had fallen asleep with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, Michael and Emma found themselves sitting at the kitchen table. The apartment was small, the paint chipped, the refrigerator humming in the corner, but Michael felt more grounded there than in his penthouse of glass and marble. He folded his hands, unsure how to begin, and finally spoke in a voice stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. "I know nothing I do can erase the years you carried alone. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to see that I will not abandon her again, and I will not walk away from you. I am not the man I was when I let you down. At least, I am trying not to be." Emma listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the table as though weighing every word. When she finally looked at him, her gaze was steady but softer than it had been before. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Michael," she admitted quietly. "But I can't deny that she smiles when she sees you now. I can't deny that she is happier with you in her life. Maybe that's enough for me to let you keep trying. For her sake." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, and Michael accepted it with gratitude that left his throat tight. In that moment he realized that love was not about grand gestures or flawless promises but about patience, humility, and the willingness to show up again and again no matter how difficult it became. As months passed, Sophia began to run to him without hesitation, her arms flung wide as she called his name. She begged for piggyback rides, insisted he join her tea parties with plastic cups and cookies, and tugged him toward playground swings where he pushed her higher and higher until her laughter filled the air. Each of these moments chipped away at the walls Emma had built, showing her a man who was not perfect but who was present, who was trying with a sincerity she had never seen in him before. The final shift came one evening on his yacht, the very symbol of the life he had once chosen over them. He invited Emma and Sophia aboard not for a party or a show but simply to spend time together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sophia leaned sleepily against his chest, her small hand curled into his shirt. Emma stood beside him, her hair catching the evening light, her blue eyes reflecting both pain and hope. Michael turned to her, his voice unsteady but true. "You were right all along. I threw away the only things that truly mattered. But I don't want to live like that anymore. I want to fight for you, and for her, every day, for the rest of my life if you'll let me." Emma held his gaze for a long moment, the silence between them filled only by the sound of waves against the hull and their daughter's gentle breathing. She did not give him a promise, not yet, but she did not look away either. And in her eyes he saw something he had not seen since the night she first told him she was carrying his child, the fragile beginnings of trust. The journey ahead would not be simple. The scars of the past would not vanish overnight. But as they stood together on the deck, the little girl who carried both their features sleeping peacefully between them, Michael felt a quiet certainty settle inside him. For the first time in his life, he was not thinking of profits or victories or power. He was thinking of a family, fragile and real, born of pain but moving toward healing. And as the stars began to appear overhead, he understood that this was the only legacy worth building.